Well, actually, I had many duties during that time. Starting in 1973, I came to Kansas City from the University of Iowa, and I was selected, one of 8 people at Iowa selected to go through the Cooperative Urban Teacher Education Student Teaching Program that the district was running at the time. So this was in 1973. Then in 1974, I caught on with the district as a teacher, and I was at Lincoln High School, and they were just beginning to integrate the faculty at that time, with Lincoln being the all-blacks, historically all-black school. And in 1974, they had just begun to put white teachers in that school. Then I taught there through 74 and 75. Then in 1975, participated in the first teacher strike, and that was a lot of fun. Then I left the district for a couple of years. My wife had gotten her master's degree, and then it was my turn. So I worked on my master's, and then I was rehired in 77 by my principal who had been at Lincoln. He was then at Westport Middle. And so I taught there for 2.5 years. And then just a couple years later, we bought a house at 3841 Campbell, back before Hyde Park was a known place to live. In fact, our area was redlined, and we had difficulty even getting a house loan in that area, because most of the homes were apartments or group homes. And then in 1983, our daughter started, and then our son started after that. In fact, he was involved in the first total immersion French class at Longan, which is now Academy Lafayette. So then, that took until 2000, so I actually went beyond the 1997 as far as involvement in the school district. Well, things like actually getting a livable wage. I think the first contract was like $6,000 then, so Kansas City was probably the lowest school district in the area on the wage scale. That was one. Number two, for a semester, usually in the second semester, you had to buy your own paper to put things on, because the district managed to run out, so supplies were not available. Your classrooms, often the wood sills were rotting and the panes would fall out, so you'd have a piece of paper covering that, or a piece of cellophane or something like that. Teaching conditions were, the buildings at that time were deplorable. Those were the main reasons, plus the fact that trying to get classes for the kids, and particularly in special ed, our kids had nothing. I mean, when I was greeted, I had no textbooks, I had no curriculum, and just was basically said good luck, and basically was expected just to warehouse those kids. And a lot of teachers in those days, that was their duty, to stay in a classroom and keep the door closed. And so we struck for maybe being able to educate children better. We had very high ideals. Well, I told you the first one, integration of faculty kind of was the first step. And when I was at Lincoln, and also when I came back to the district, I think the district tried to self-integrate. They sent some kids from black schools to Southwest, Van Horn, Border Star, some of the schools that had a white majority then. Even then, there weren't very many. But that was kind of the first attempt, and then you had the Arthur Benson and the deseg court case, which tried to integrate everything. I love the desegregation effort for a number of reasons. Number one, my children benefited greatly. At Longin, we were kind of disappointed. We had our daughter in Longin before deseg. It was a neighborhood school, and it was one of the better neighborhood schools in the district at the time. But then the court said, well, you're now a French magnet. Of course, we asked, Arthur Benson lived in the neighborhood. We asked Arthur, we asked the Desegregation Monitoring Committee, can we change the theme? And basically, nope, this is what you are going to be. And so in an effort to initiate a program, I was president of the parents group at that time. Of course, I think we usually had meetings with 2 or 3, so it wasn't that we had a really large functioning group, but I went there most often, so they made me president. And the district, Juana Highshaw was the principal, and I can't remember who was the curriculum coordinator. But those 2 ladies from the district, and then I believe it was 3 parents, had the option of going and seeing a total immersion classroom in San Diego or a partial immersion classroom in Cincinnati. And I was on the total immersion trip to San Diego, and we were blown away simply by what was going on there. So we came back and we had to convince the other group, we had to convince parents that total immersion was the way to go. And then my son started, he was in the kindergarten class of the total immersion, and we took it on faith that he'd learned to read English and become as competent in English as in French. But within 2 or 3 years, it was a nationally known program. Those kids had people from all over the country coming in, and they were great performers. So they'd sit there and say they're French and wow the people. But what really encouraged me about language immersion is that language acquisition is innate at the age 4 to 5, and it's innate in every person of color, creed, religion. It doesn't matter, it's there. And what they have found that the listening skills are enhanced, the self-image is enhanced, and these kids score better. And even some of the kids, more of the disadvantaged kids did the same. So we found that in a few years, Longin was often leading the district in terms of test scores. These kids were learning English well and scoring at a much higher percentage than their counterparts in the district. Unfortunately, through politics, the union, and urban myths, the program was about ready to be gotten rid of, and so then they chartered. And it's Academy Lafayette today. It's the highest charter school in the country, and even the minority kids and the free lunch kids there score much higher than their counterparts in the district. And Longin continued for a few years after that, and it was a partial immersion class, and that program was always 95 to 100% full, and always most often made their AYPs on their test scores. So very lucky, and my son stayed in that program through 8th grade, and then the district, in infinite wisdom, cut the program. At the high school level, Southeast was supposed to be the International Baccalaureate High School, and you had all these kids that had all this language and abilities flowing into the high school, and then they said, sorry. And so, well, my son had already told me he wanted to be an artist, so he went over to Paseo. My daughter also, and son-in-law, opened the new Paseo building in 1996. They auditioned over at Switzer. In fact, my daughter had gone to gifted and talented school at Switzer, an awful building. And it's kind of good that they closed it. It should have probably been closed 40 years before it was. But both my son and daughter were in the first graduating class in the new school, and I went to the portfolio day. They were in visual arts because one day my daughter said, I'm going to private art school, and I said, over my dead body. So I went home, told my wife I probably drew that line a little strong, but I had no idea what a private art school was. And so anyway, I read all the stuff that she brought home from the school. So the The agreement was 3 private art schools and 2 state schools. Well, she never got around to applying to the 2 state schools, but anyway, she and my son-in-law both ended up receiving scholarships to the Maryland Institute College of Art, the second-rated private art school in the country. And my daughter went on to graduate. She got her master's there and is in her 16th year of teaching art in an inner-city school in Chelsea, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. So they had a great experience. And their friends living at 38th and Campbell, they had a lot of minority friends come. We had a 3-story house. We were renting the 3rd floor, but we had plenty of room on the 2 stories. So often a lot of minority friends stayed there. In fact, my son's best friend was Hispanic, and he's starting his son at Longin this year. So we're starting the 2nd generation there at Longin, and it's too bad it's not a public school. And one of the myths I heard throughout the desegregation days is black children didn't want to go to school. White children, well, 3 of my son's best friends from high school, black friends, moved to Minneapolis at one time or another to be either to live with Jared or be around Jared. And when they came back home, they always had a gathering of kids in the inner city. I really think, particularly Paseo, because those kids were not interested in color, class, creed. They were interested in being creative, and they were supportive of each other. And I was asked in 1998, Dr. Demps was superintendent, and he decided he wanted to establish site committees in all the schools. And Kauffman Foundation got a grant, and there were 8 schools that were targeted to develop site committees, and those were composed of the principal, teachers, parents, community members, and students. And then after the teachers tried to get the students out of there, I stood up and said, no, this is our school. And I said, I know most of these young people individually, and they deserve to be here. So after we got over establishing turf wars, then we had to make an action plan. And one of the things that we did was develop an action plan of remediation. The teachers wanted Paseo to go to 2.5 grade point average in order to go there. It was 2 at the time. We said we don't need any more Lincolns. You know, that's siphoning off enough of the good students. And also art being an innate talent. Sometimes these kids had art talent but not necessarily had the background in education. Why not remediate these kids? Keep the grade point at 2.0 and let's go from there. And actually, we had a very nice plan. I think we had the best plan of the 8 schools. And in fact, some of the schools never got off the ground. But Dorothy Shepard, who had been principal there, and then that year had been chosen to go downtown and be an assistant superintendent, was in charge of the program. She got violently ill and died very shortly after we got done with our action plan. Then Mr. Demps was asked to leave, and a new superintendent came in, and I guess the program was put in file 13. I have contacted both Kauffman and the district because we never got a personal copy of it, but it would have been nice. But we kind of predated. The thing that I saw in the district, that the problem wasn't racial, the problem was remediation. The problem was, how do we get these kids prepared for school? And then the ones that are there that are 2 or 3 years behind, how do we get them caught up? And that was a vicious cycle that we were in over the years. And it wasn't a racial thing, it wasn't anything other than, you know, they came to school unprepared. And so I was always glad to become a special ed teacher because it actually taught me how to teach. And I was taught pre-tests and post-tests. I developed my own individualized math program for the kids at Westport. I had nothing, so I just had to, you know, make up worksheets. I made up sheets. My wife was in language and speech pathology, and she had to create all these programs. And so I developed my own type of IEP. So if the parents came in, they knew where the kids started, they knew where they were at the end of the year, they knew how much they accomplished. So, and then I transferred in 1979, 1980 to a regular classroom because I really wanted to teach regular kids. I mean, I enjoyed my special ed kids. The year that group graduated and went across the street to Westport Senior, the last day of school, they were rather rambunctious, and I was kind of wondering what was up. And the last class in the last hour of the school year, they brought a painting. Obviously, someone had probably picked off the street somewhere. It was a horrible painting, but it stayed on my walls of my house for many, many years. And then and I looked for that, and I couldn't find it. But there was a piece of white parchment paper or white paper with a pink ribbon around it, and when I opened it up, it said "World's Greatest Teacher." So you got to love that. I mean, but the frustrating thing with EMH kids is that they started in the same place each year. They ended in the same place, regardless of efforts to push. So I transferred into a regular class, and the first thing I did is I gave my 132 students, or how many I had in the regular class, reading assessment test. Well, I had 32 in 7th grade scoring pre-primer or below. Well, as a dutiful teacher, I went to the counselor with 32 referrals for special testing, thinking, I would get a pat on the back. Well, the principal did come up and said if I referred any more kids, he'd fire me because I was overburdening his counseling staff. So that was part of the problem that we had, that even if we tried to help the kids, it wasn't set up to really help kids. It was set up to warehouse kids. The kids that could make it did fine. You also had a tracking system, A, B, and C tracking systems, and I don't know at what grade those kids were tracked, but you couldn't get them out. So I had one young lady reading at a sophomore in college level, but she was tracked at C, which meant that she wouldn't be able to take college preparatory courses. So it was an evil system to begin with, and I burned out about a semester there. And also we were beginning to be tested at the end of the year, and the teacher was going to be held accountable for the test scores. Well, how can I be held accountable for these test scores when a third of the kids I have can't even read? And the readability of my textbook was sophomore in college. I had 2 kids that actually tested sophomore in college. I only had 2 kids out of 132 that could read the textbook because nobody bothered to test the readability. It was, whoever evaluated textbooks they looked nice and they had pretty pictures, but nobody really bothered to see whether the kids could actually read the textbooks or not. So that's my story. So I was real happy to be involved in the site committee, and I had hoped that site councils would be developed at all the schools. The superintendent before this one had started the process, but then when he resigned, that whole process went out the window, so we're still not there yet. Well, in our neighborhood, we had a number of people start their children in the Kansas City School District. And then we had a lot of people move. And I think initially, back when we were teaching, as a staff in 74, 75, integration was far from our, we just wanted to teach the kids, it was what we had. We knew that there were some schools that had, more white kids and more A-track students and better availability to classes, but we were more concerned with the day-to-day. I thought it was. I remember standing outside my door in 75 between classes, and I struck up a conversation with a young lady, and I said, if you had your wish, what, of education places, what would your wish be? And she said it would be to go to Southwest because those kids have a lot more opportunities. So I think actually think the kids, a lot, and particularly the better students, thought a lot more about it than the adults did. And then when it happened, you know, it was a great opportunity, and it allowed my wife and I to stay in the central city and to educate our kids in a public school system and keep their college funds available and not spend that. So we were excited about that, but I think a lot of the people were taken aback by the scope of it, where every school became a magnet, and you know, the cost was something, but the community had not passed a bond issue in, you know, 30 years. The buildings were deteriorating, so something had to be done, and I think that was a good thing. But the problem was the first 10 years was more buildings and equipment than it was actually working on the themes. The second 10 years you were supposed to evaluate the themes, keep the ones that were working, or reinforce the ones that could be helped. But unfortunately, the plug was pulled before the second stage was able to be implemented. So I think people were hopeful, but there was always negativity towards the Kansas City School District. And most people thought it was typical government waste of money. Well, as I said, when I was teaching, we were more interested in surviving the day and teaching the children. And actually, during the teacher strike, I didn't participate in the second one. In fact, I voted against the second one in '77, and I was able to get into the meeting because I had substituted. You had to show a check stub showing that you had spent some time in the schools during that time. And so I voted against going out on strike. But even when we talked about the strike, integration was not mentioned, you know, and the teachers were just trying to teach the children they had. And, you know, there was a hope that we could be like a Shawnee Mission someday or another place, but at least among the faculty and in the community, I think most of the community, at least on the west side of Troost, a lot of them had given up on the Kansas City School District and were already preparing their kids. And I think the parents on the east side were never very well educated as to what the desegregation program was about or the benefits that could be accrued. But I must say the parents of my friends of my children, the minority parents, were very much in favor of it and were very gracious to our children, and I really, their kids turned out very well and were successes in life. So it was kind of a mixed bag. The kids wanted it. And the kids wanted an opportunity, and that's one of the beautiful things about the DESEG program is kids got opportunities. They could be scientists, they could be linguists, they could learn foreign languages, they could do art, they could do theater. You know, you had the performing arts as well as the visual arts magnet. Central, you could do any sport that you wanted, and a school full of computers at the time. You know, I can't speak for everyone, but it was certainly a change from what was available before the court order, which was basically dirty old schools and falling apart schools, textbooks 20 to 30 years old. You'd probably run out of mimeograph paper by the semester, and pretty much hopelessness. I mean, if you were a good student, I read Roger Williams said on his interview that there was always pockets of very good students in Kansas City, and there always has been, and those kids were able to overcome. But for the majority of the students, no, that was not the case. Well, just integrating my children into the school district, and to be thanked for them as they grew up, to be, I get emotional, sorry, to be in a situation to meet people, different people, to have that experience. And they had the experience of being minorities. I mean, you know, even at Paseo, 25% of the school was majority, but the rest was minorities. And to make friends and to understand, and they've both become, very caring adults. As I say, my daughter is carrying on the tradition of teaching, 16 years in a school district that's 95% English second language. They've enrolled their daughter. She's in second grade in the public district there, doing well. My son, who told me he was never going to have children, I keep hoping he will change his mind, but may not, but he's very involved in the Black Lives Matter movement in Minneapolis. And he probably posts some things on Facebook that kind of worries me sometimes, talking about abuse of people. So it was a great experience for them. And I guess it bothers me because we've got a revisionist history going on in certain parts of the community. But I think that the black children who had parents who took advantage of the system were very successful. And I don't think, there's a myth that the white students that participated took advantage of the black students and to get better educational opportunities. They couldn't. I mean, you had quotas as long as you got them enrolled properly at the right time, and all my sons and daughters' minority friends, parents got them enrolled at the right time. If you did that, you had your school choice. Some of the people were angry with the total immersion because after first grade there was closed enrollment. Well, you can see where it would have to be. If you're immersing these children, you can't start in fourth grade and try to immerse a child in a foreign language. It doesn't work. So, and some of these people who negate the school district really filled their pockets during the time of the desegregation program, and yet at the same time we're saying that it was not a good program. So I've worked for the school district as a community member up until about 2 years ago, and I was part of the hands-on movement, and to be in that you had to sit through a history of the school district, and then you had to sign a paper that you understood it. Well, I refused to sign a paper because I said, this isn't what happened. At least from my experience, I lived this. And I'm not going to sign it. I said, if you don't want me to be in this program, that's fine, but I'm not going to sign something that's wrong. And they allowed me to stay. I guess they wanted me to be a part of it. But I am really appreciative of this opportunity to at least talk about the school district from my viewpoint, and I think my wife shares my viewpoint and the kids that it was a very successful endeavor for them, and they're eternally grateful to be able to have had, they had more opportunities. If I'd kept them in the greatest private schools in Kansas City, they would not have had the opportunities that they did. My dreams and hopes were dashed when it was discontinued because, as I say, it was supposed to be a 20-year program. It never got to the point of where it could, you developed Lincoln Prep, college preparatory, which I have mixed emotions about. One of the most successful schools in the state of Missouri came out of deseg. Paseo at a time was considered one of the top 10 visual and performing arts schools in the country. Academy Longan, French immersion, we had people from all over the country coming and looking at our program. And it was a great program up until the time it was forced to charter. Border Star, the Montessori program. You had the African-centered program, which was one of the first programs set up there. When you look back at it, that's a track record of success that's pretty darn good. Okay, did we reach the majority of the students? No. And part of it was that, you know, it was very difficult. There, even at 35,000, it was hard to get to all the student individual needs, and that part of it probably wasn't as successful. We should have maybe gone back to, you know, in that other 10-year period that were denied some more neighborhood schools, cut down a little bit on the busing, because that was a major objection. But the ironic fact is when C-Trust wanted to take over the school district, I got into one of the meetings. I wasn't supposed to, but I worked. And the program that they were proposing was deseg light. I mean, now all of a sudden people wanted opportunities. They wanted themed schools. So, you know, we kind of come full circle, and maybe we didn't appreciate what we had. And I think I had wished that all students in Kansas City could have had the experience my children did. Well, I was never high enough on the totem pole to have a role. I mean, I did my job as a teacher. It was very interesting that the principal had hired me, but 4 times a year he threatened to fire me, and I kept saying, well, Mr. Brown, you know, you hired me at Lincoln, you hired me at Westport Middle, why do you keep threatening to fire me? Because he said, well, you don't go by the rules. And I said, well, the rules here are not very good. And I would rather educate children than go by the rules. So I wasn't probably in line for, and I didn't want to be an administrator. I simply wanted to teach. So I think my role was to be a good teacher, and then as a parent, I was an advocate. I will always take pride in establishing how we established that program at Longin. I was always usually involved in the parents group, very often president, but there's an urban myth that said, well, all those Hyde Park yuppies took over the parents group at Longin. Well, the fact was that 2 times I deferred to black parents and stepped down, and we put them in as presidents because we wanted black parents to be there. We wanted black parents to be the president. I've never cared really about titles or that, and did the same thing at Paseo. Stepped aside a couple times, or I co-chaired, the top spot on the group there, and I take great pride at Paseo because when they picked people to be on the site committee, it was picked by the SAC parents themselves. So I mean, it wasn't just I was designated as that, and it was predominantly minority, so I had minority parents who voted for me. So I think that aspect is that I worked well and tried very hard to promote, and have always been an advocate for the district, even though it's been very hard at times. But people would say, well, you're different. You and your wife are different. And I said, no, we're not any different. We made this a priority to do this. And our children were never at risk. Our children were never beaten up, terrorized, or bullied, to the best of my knowledge. My daughter said there were some incidences in middle school, which kind of irritate me because she didn't say anything about it till 20 years after the fact, but for the most part. So that's sort of been my role as, at age 21, I came to be a savior. I was going to save the Kansas City School District, and so I ended up just, using the services of it and as a parent. So I don't know. That's a tough one. Well, they were a mixed bag. Before the The district-wide integration, the kids that were on the A track normally tested pretty well and got their choices of colleges. During the deseg program, the kids that were at Lincoln, and I know Paseo was putting almost as many kids in college as Lincoln was at the time, and some of the other programs were. But with the kids that were struggling, as I said, my frustration is I was about 30 years ahead of my time now with computers, and that you can do remediation. If a child doesn't understand a lesson, they can either go back or have a similar lesson and be remediated along the way. Each of the children have a prescriptive program, education program as I understand it. And that's what we needed. Plus the fact early education, we didn't have any access to any type of early education. That has shown to make a difference. I've never been very impressed with Title I in the district. I mean, we got a lot of projectors that didn't work and other things when you got to the high school, but as far as Title I making a big difference, I didn't see it. Maybe it did at the elementary. But there's a lot more we could have done. People are mad at the building. You know, you tore down 2 buildings, Central and Paseo, and those people are still angry about it. But I talked with one of the architects at Paseo, and he said there were structural difficulties in Paseo that would have made the building unsafe in a few years anyway. Plus, it wasn't built as a visual and performing arts. So I was glad for the construction. I think that when we closed 30 buildings, we at least had 30 buildings that could still house children, and we still need to fix those up. There's a lot of deferred maintenance, but it allowed the district to maintain and at least have somewhat good buildings for the children to go to. The repurposing program I was involved in, the repurposing of Longan, I fought for that to become Academy Lafayette, which it has become, and now they've added it in addition, and it's about twice the enrollment as it was as a public school, but that's how popular the program is. I think the repurposing program in general has been wonderful. You know, I kind of feel sad when I drive by Manual at 39th, well, Manual, that's way back, or Westport Middle when I drive by it, but I always told people that that school was a great warehouse, not really a great school building, so I think it will serve a great purpose on what it's being repurposed as. So I think that was a positive, even though there was a lot of money and there was a lot of waste. Well, I think for my kids, the greatest social outcome was to be familiar with children of other races, and to see the problems that they go through, and to see the joys that comes from that association. So I think in the schools that worked, that was a great outcome. I'm probably sorry that many of the schools did not integrate as fully as some of the programs, so those children missed the opportunity. But I think that people getting to know each other, if you want to end the race problem, I think this is what you do. You get people to go to school together, you know, and they're life friends. And then as I say, my granddaughter now is in a urban school and a mixed environment, doing well, and I'm glad to see that that's passed on. And so I think that's the advantage of what the desegregation program could have been. It really didn't make a difference, and it certainly didn't make a great difference in residential patterns, which is sad to me. While I do live in Hyde Park, I live in a fully integrated neighborhood. We're 2 blocks from Truce, so you know, we're not the Jansen Place or that type of resident. And the sad thing is when it was declared desegregated by Judge Whipple, it was more segregated than it had been when I was teaching, and that continues. And now with the advent of the charter schools, it's becoming even more segregated. And then the last closing of schools really irritated me, the closing of Southwest. And there are only 5 public school buildings west of Troost. So the school district has basically abandoned public education west of Troost. They give you a lot of excuses for it, but I don't think there is an excuse. And so we concentrate our efforts east of Troost, and I wish the district well, but I think there was a great fallacy in doing that. So we've re-segregated the schools. We still have segregated neighborhoods. What did we accomplish? Probably not very much. Individuals like my children who had successful experiences, it helped a lot. But overall, we're at the same, well, we're even worse off than we were before as far as school segregation, but that's going on across the country. Overall, I think Kansas City is doing a much better job. Part of it is, when I was teaching, there were 65,000 students in 78 to 80 school buildings, and they weren't very good managers. I think that with the 12 or 13 or 14,000 students, it's more manageable. I attended a lot of the RSIT meetings. I wasn't even a designated person. I just came as a community person. I retired early. I saw the things that were being done in order to improve test scores. And that's the sad thing, is we improve test scores. We don't improve knowledge. We don't improve abilities. We just, we just improve test scores. But I guess hopefully somewhere along the way there is a correlation. The district's done a great job in that, in spite of the state's effort, every effort to close it, to minimize it, to distribute it. So it's kind of like a cat. It's had many lives. But the thing that I've seen, I don't spend a lot of time there, but I went to some SAC meetings at Paseo for a time, and my wife and I gave $16,000 over 2 years to Paseo in thanks for what the program had done for our children. And the first $8,000 was during the time of testing, and they were able to get more buses, more tutors in there. And Paseo and Lincoln were the only 2 high schools that met state accreditation guidelines. Hopefully they've kept that. So that's positive. The emphasis on early education, we're getting kids educated because many of our minority students came in 2 and 3 years behind by the time they entered school, and they just fell further behind, and by the time we picked them up in secondary education, it was too late. And then plus the system, as I said before, wasn't set up to remediate, so we basically passed them along. So I don't think those days are quite as, it's done that way these days. So I see great success and change in the district, and they should be fully accredited. The state's jerking them around for another year. But I see positives. But on the other hand, when my son graduated, it was unaccredited, but all the high schools had a North Central accreditation then, and so their grades were accepted. That's one of the things I couldn't talk to people about, that even though you're not accredited, as long as your individual schools have accreditation, high schools, they're going to be able to go to college. So my son, as long as he made a certain mark on his ACT test, was able to go to any college that he chose. So, I have a great wish for public education because, my wife and I were both publicly educated in Iowa. We're both graduates of the University of Iowa. I got my master's here at UMKC, so public education, and we were both teachers in school districts. So public education has always been important, and it will always be necessary. And I hate it that the charters are not evaluated on the same as the state schools are. We probably have half or less as many charters. Well, there are some charters that are performing well. And as long as they're performing well, I guess it doesn't make a difference. But there will always be public schools because even the charters cannot educate some of the most difficult to educate children that the public schools are asked to educate. So just do it the best they can. And, you know, I wish we could have more widespread success than just Lincoln Academy and Paseo, at least from the secondary standpoint. I'd like to see desegregation, but well, the courts, you know, they copped out. It should have been integration. It should not have been desegregation, because the whole thing of Kansas City, the plaza, and the great interstates and all that were ways of people escaping the inner city. And the centers, the North Kansas cities, the other school districts should have been involved. And it was very interesting because the courts asked the suburban districts to take kids voluntarily. The only school district that did was Missouri City, a little K-8 school, you know, near Liberty. They were the only ones. They took 4 kids. And the districts walked away from a lot of money that would have been involved in terms of taking kids. So I think if we're ever, and I think the days of mandating are probably over, but we should have mandated integration. And, you know, all the schools that serve the city limits of Kansas City, Missouri should have been involved. And until that happens, I don't see much hope for, you can't desegregate something that's, well, at this point is almost totally desegregated on its own. So I don't know what the answer is. I gave up at the age of 63. I finally said I'm done. So Dr. Carruthers knows I go to church at 38th and Troost. We're working on trying to remodel our downstairs and put in a state-of-the-art walk-in center for high school students. We work with the kids at De La Salle or people in our parish area. So I'm still trying in one shape or another, but I don't know. The desegregation time was a wonderful time for our family and many of the families that our kids were associated with. And sometimes we deprecate success, and I don't quite understand. Oh, well, those kids should have been successful, but they were, you know. Paseo sent kids into the music industry, into the performing industry, into the theater, into the visual arts areas. Amazing things that those kids did, and it just wasn't white kids, it was minority kids of all types. But we deprecate that and say, well, my kid didn't have that, you know, didn't have that opportunity. But yes, they did, if they had taken that opportunity. And part of the thing is we didn't educate parents well enough on the opportunities. And it was a great change to go from a neighborhood system to completely all magnets, and that was probably way too ambitious. Amen.
Thank you.